Hello, and welcome to the W4M Roundtable. I'm your host, Tiffany Foster, President of Women for Mentors, and I'm so glad that you've decided to join us today. For those of you that are joining us for the first time, the Women for Mentors organization is dedicated to helping women returning to education through mentorship and scholarship. And part of an extension of that is why we came up with the W4M Roundtable. We choose to use this as mentorship extension and just bring different guests and different viewpoints to our audience and help us all grow as a community and learn from each other. So in today's conversation, we're going to be discussing a hard topic, breaking the silence, understanding domestic violence, and strengthening our communities. Today's session is produced in partnership with Pinnacle Strategic Advisors. And joining me today is Ginny Overbay. I would like to invite her in to come on and be part of the conversation and help me co-host this topic. Hi, Ginny.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here today. So this is an important topic, and I just want to have a note that the discussion of domestic violence, abuse, trauma, and related sensitive topics. Some of this content may be especially emotionally difficult or triggering for certain individuals. So viewers and listeners are advised to just use discretion. And if you know somebody who's experiencing domestic violence or is in immediate danger, please seek support from local authorities, a trusted professional, or a domestic violence support organization. So with this, let's introduce our guest. We'd like to bring in Katrin Doyle. Katrin is a trauma-informed clinician and educator focused on community healing, violence prevention, and building trauma response systems. She currently serves as outreach coordinator for Helpmate, Buncombe County's domestic violence service organization, where she leads community education, professional training, and partnership initiatives aimed at preventing domestic violence and strengthening community response to trauma.
Bye.
Welcome, Katrin. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm grateful.
Awesome. Can you tell us a little bit more just about you and your background and where you work with Helpmate?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hello, everyone. My name's Katrin. I went to school for neuroscience, ended up in an abusive relationship and had a left turn out of that life, and now work for a domestic violence agency that I, at one time, received services from about 7 years ago. I am a person who went through and got an MSW. I'm a clinician. I do most of my time educating people about domestic violence in a lot of different contexts, and spend almost all of my time doing direct service and occasionally doing professional training. So I'm really grateful to be here. That's how I ended up here. I'm a multi-generational survivor. My mom was a survivor, grandma, great-grandma. So have all kinds of lived experience, professional experience, been on both sides of the desk, and happy to talk about both sides of the experience.
I really appreciate that. And I know that we're going to dig into lots of topics around this. And I think what's really great for our audience too is just, I know you're going to be able to shed some light and maybe even debunk some myths, associated with domestic violence and what it looks like. So we really just appreciate that you're here to have this candid discussion with us. So since you work so closely, in your role in Help Me and just providing education and training, could you just start us off with just talking about what domestic violence actually includes? I think a lot of times people think it's strictly physical violence, and there might be an image that people have in their head of what it looks like, but just let us know kind of what it encompasses.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the kind of thing that we're talking about abuse, is talking about a system of power and control that exists in a relationship. So the way that abuse happens is when a person is seeking power over others in the relationship. And the way that they accomplish that power is by a lot of coercive control tactics. So coercion, very simply, is forcing a yes from an obvious no, or just from a basic no. So that could be, someone sticking a knife in someone's back and saying, "Give me your money." That's coercive, all the way up into someone throwing a 7-hour tantrum if they don't get to have sex with their partner. So coercive control is the heart of abusive dynamics, and it manifests in a lot of different ways. The physical and sexual violence that happens in domestic violence is the obviously bad part that people are like, oh, that's what they think of. They think about physical and sexual violence. But the meat of coercion is usually a lot more subtle than that. And it looks a couple different ways. One, it looks like emotional and psychological abuse, which is, one of the more popular words right now is gaslighting. Gaslighting is the process by which a person attempts to make you question your ability to perceive reality by trying to turn things around using a tactic called DARVO, which I probably will talk about more later. So abusive, emotional, and psychological things, put downs, shaming people, guilt tripping people as a way to gain power over them or to get something from them, which is pretty consistent in cross abusive relationships. You also see stalking behavior, so showing up where people are not invited, following people around, just classic stalking, and also stalking through technology. So if people are monitoring their people in their relationship using location services on apps, using stealth software installed or malware installed on people's devices that like clones their phone or creates like keystroke tracking or something like that. People using AirTags, tiles, things of that nature to stalk people. That's pretty ubiquitous now in domestic violence, so stalking through technology is a big part of it. We also see financial abuse. So someone who is forcing money out of the survivor or who is putting the survivor in a period of, or yeah, in a position of forced financial dependence on their abusive partner by sabotaging work in a lot of different ways, or by in some way just forcing that financial dependence, which usually makes it really hard for people to leave. We also see abusive people using physical intimidation, not just physical violence. So, like getting up in someone's face, destroying their property, punching holes in walls, that kind of thing is considered physical abuse in the umbrella of domestic violence. We also have social abuse. So, isolation is a huge part of abusive relationships. One, it could be coming down from the abuser, like, oh, every time you go and see your sister, we have a problem. So you're done seeing your sister because you don't defend me when you talk to her, something like that. Also, when people disclose abuse to their loved ones and friends and family and coworkers, the way that we're conditioned to respond to that violence is usually to like immediately be like, oh my God, leave, leave. Like we freak out, right? And that kind of reaction not only is obviously upsetting for the person who's not maybe ready to let go yet, but also usually victim blames, puts blame on the survivor for what's happening and creates social isolation where the survivor can't get that kind of support from their loved ones. And then we also see survivors experiencing a lot of shame and often believing that they are the cause of the abuse, and so they kind of naturally pull away from social supports. So we have financial, we have social, we have stalking, we have physical intimidation, and we have emotional and psychological abuse as part of a system of domestic violence.
Yeah, and that's covers a very broad spectrum because I do think obviously with people like you that are bringing more information or for people so people really understand what it looks like. I think there was that old stigma that in my mind what I picture is it's the woman walking with big sunglasses on, you know what I mean, and covering up the bruise on her cheek. But yeah, what you described is encompassing so much more. And it seems like that would almost be kind of hard to sometimes spot and recognize, like for outsiders too, especially. Do you find that that's the case?
Yeah, so reported rates of domestic violence right now, according to the North Carolina Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the CDC, are 1 in 3 women, 1 in 4 men, and half, so 1 in 2 of people who are trans or non-binary are reporting that they have been physically or sexually assaulted by a romantic partner at some point in their lifetime. So that's just reported rates, and that's just for physical and sexual assaults. So we can assume that this experience is largely like ubiquitous, meaning like almost every single person has some lived experience of receiving abusive behavior, abusive action. So yeah, I think that there's a lot of reasons why we don't talk about DV in the way that it is. One, because it really upsets people because most people have lived experience on both directions, either creating abusive environments or having to exist in one. And we also have people, because it's such a huge public social health problem, people don't know how to take a bite out of it because it's so big. So I think that's my feeling towards it is that it's hard to, in a culture that doesn't really have shared understanding or shared language about like what healthy conflict management is or what like healthy communication is or what any of those skills are. So then like when we do recognize we're experiencing abuse, we start to feel that all of our relationships are bad. And so then we become really spun out, right? So I
Yeah.
think that that's what probably the major contributor to why we see people not really self-identifying with this dynamic.
Wow, that's incredible. And like, so let's like, can we like go, I guess, a little deeper into that too? Like, so the trauma, um, that comes about from this, like for the survivors, and how like they respond to like these abusive situations. Can you just talk a little bit more about, what that looks like? And then even for people listening too, that maybe want to help support somebody who's a survivor, or is going through it, like walk us through what that right way to handle that, what that looks like, you know?
Yeah, okay. I'm going to spend time with the first part and I'll come back to how to support.
Yeah.
So, first part, what are the impacts to survivors of domestic violence? For one, most people develop post-traumatic stress. Whether it becomes a disorder is dependent on the person, but almost everyone experiences post-traumatic stress. Because we're a social species, we're pack animals, we're really wired for social connection, it creates a significant attachment rupture that really ends up having massive consequences. So, very basically, there is a part of your brain that is called the amygdala. In an adult, it's about the size of an almond, and it essentially functions as the guard dog of your body. The amygdala turns on well before you're born, and it does not turn off for a second. Not when you're sleeping, not when you're not paying attention. It never turns off until you're like very, very, very dead. That's the deal. So I say that to say, like, even in the moments, whatever, the amygdala is constantly, constantly on. The guard dog is scanning your environment through all of your seven senses, through your emotional experiences, through your attachments, and through some other things that I think are too complicated maybe for the time we have. But it's scanning constantly for threat to you as a biological organism. Because we're social species, threats include social threats. So it used to be that trauma had a really narrow and rigid definition that was basically like something horrific happens to you, and as a result, you behave horrifically. Like that's how it used to be thought of. What is a more scientifically accurate definition now in 2026 is that the amygdala, the guard dog, will categorize things as traumatic impressions or traumatic memories if you ended up feeling helpless to respond to the threat you were given. So anything that makes you feel overwhelmed and helpless will be categorized in your brain as a threat. And for this purpose, a life threat, right? So something really dramatic. When people have PTSD, what happened or when they experience post-traumatic stress, they're reacting to quote unquote perceived threats. So like the difference between a quote unquote real threat and a perceived threat is that a real threat would be perceived by everybody and a perceived threat would be specific to the person based on their lived experience and their history. So if a bear walked into this room, all three of us would react to a bear being on screen with me, you
Yeah.
know? But if a person walked behind me and had the same deodorant on as my abusive parent, I would react, but y'all would not. That would make no sense to you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. It's it's kind of it's like our little filing system. Like we have this own internal, and we put it into like, oh, this is a danger file.
Yes.
It just keeps going there like every time. That makes a lot of sense in why, someone might react strongly in a situation when everybody around them's like, what you doing? Like,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the
I've experienced that myself. Just I'm speaking from lived experience. Yeah.
right.
Definitely happened. Yeah.
It's a thing, and it
Yeah.
creates even deeper impacts socially because then we're perceived. So I'll say this, when I say react, what
Yeah.
I mean is that a person experiences a fight, flight, or freeze response. So
Yes.
fight is any kind of movement towards the threat to neutralize it. Flight
Yeah.
is any kind of movement away from the threat to avoid it. And freeze is a submit or a collapse or a shutdown response. So,
I could give you an example really quick.
yeah.
I can, so I will say I've talked about this before because I dealt with all of my things, but I at one point didn't realize that I was living in this kind of trauma response. And I was working in an office and I walked out and somebody called my name because they wanted to get my attention to come talk to like a group of people. And screamed at the top of my lungs. My hands went up in the air. I ducked down on the ground, and I'm like, and I look around, and everybody's just looking at me like, you okay, buddy? And I felt so embarrassed and so ashamed because I was like, I don't know why I just did that. Like I'm in a safe environment. I saw these people when I walked into the room.
Yes.
But it was a very, reaction. So this is tracking for me, and I'm hoping this helps other people put the pieces together as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, yes, you really nailed the core of what I'm saying, which is that survivors experience post-traumatic stress. They very rarely have any context for what that is or what it means. And so they think they're crazy a lot of the time, and people treat them like they're crazy. So it's like this never-ending whirlpool of suffering. And when you're chronically activated or your body is constantly responding to threats, you get physically exhausted and you can become chronically ill as well. So, people who experience trauma, experience post-traumatic stress are often showing up with GI problems, autoimmune disorders, long-term chronic health conditions, much more so than someone who does not have those lived experiences. So, I would say physically, socially, emotionally, spiritually, the impacts are really quite detrimental and really, really global for survivors.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So when for somebody, to kind of move forward through kind of like that trauma experience, um, for somebody that's maybe in an abusive relationship, and it's really, I think one of the things that there's a lot of stigmas around that, where people, don't understand why they don't leave, and or even why they didn't leave sooner, maybe, once they do leave. And so, yeah, can you talk a little bit through that, like the victim blaming that kind of comes, around that a little bit?
Yes, I would love to. Will you remind me at some point, one of y'all, to come back to how to support someone who's having PTSD
Yes.
responses? Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, yes, with this question, why don't people leave and the stigma associated with it? The answer to the question, why don't people leave? For one, most importantly, especially when we talk about victim blaming, the day that you leave an abusive partner, all the way up into 2 years after you've already left them, your risk of being murdered by that person increases by 450%. So the day that you leave a person is the most dangerous day of the relationship, even if it was horrifically violent the entire time, violence is much more likely to escalate to homicide at that point, which is really scary because almost everybody's first response is like, get out, pack your bags, like tonight, right? Like we have this massive fear response, which makes so much sense because we are justice motivated, we're protective, and of course, it's normal to be afraid of abuse, right? And it's not a good idea for survivors. Safety planning, which I like to talk, I sometimes use the metaphor of like basically gone girling, though I'm not saying you should plan your own death. I'm saying like the more that a person has thought through where they're going, how they're getting there, what their transportation will be, what their financial plan is, what's the case for custody. Like thinking through every single detail in minutia is life-saving before you leave that person. So, contrary to popular belief, an extra week or an extra month with a person you've already been being abused by for a long time is probably a lower risk if you're able to come up with a plan that can keep you away from them long term. Because the cycle of leaving and coming back also really escalates the likelihood of homicide. So most survivors leave and come back about 7 to 12 times on average. And when I say leave, it's not always like pack up, leave, move out. Sometimes it's like, we're done, right? It's the breakup conversation. And then 2 hours later, you're back, right? So 7 to 12 times is the average. That's not because people don't understand how serious their situation is. It's because there are barriers to them leaving. The vast majority of the time, it's financial. So, for example, I live in Buncombe County, I live in Asheville. Median income here in Asheville for women is $38,000 a year. Rent for a one-bedroom apartment in Asheville is $1,800, right? If you have a child, a two-bedroom apartment is $2,200 on average here in Asheville. So financials are a huge part of why people end up having to stay with abusive people. Custody of children is another big one. So in North Carolina, this is a 50-50 state for custody, even in the case sometimes of domestic violence, which means that you could lose your children half of the time to a person who you believe and you know is dangerous, right? So, and lawyers are expensive. That's a great point, right? So, this is the deal, right? Is that people would rather be with their children 100% of the time and serve as a buffer between that abuse and their children than give, the abuser half-time custody. Um, or allow them at least. And I'm just giving you just a couple of examples. Also, people are allowed to love other people, right? So, like, love maybe the abusive person doesn't love us as much as we wish they did, but we certainly love them. And we kind of make up for that in loving them a lot, right? Usually have very high empathy, usually are very connected, very family oriented. And so survivors end up really believing and hoping and having faith in the version of that person that they sometimes get glimpses of. One of the biggest myths in domestic violence is that domestic violence offenders are like Disney cartoon level villains. I wish that that would go away. If people were like that, no one would date them. No one would marry them. That's not how it works. They are human beings. They show up with human strengths and human vulnerability sometimes. That's kind of the core of a trauma bond, is that you're always waiting for that human part of them to resurface. So that's
Yeah,
why people don't leave.
yeah,
In summation.
yeah, yeah. That's really interesting. And I think trying to have that empathetic view of understanding like that it's probably a lot more complicated than people realize. And there can be everybody's different, every situation's different, and understanding that it doesn't always fit in a box. And that's why I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because this is something that it's like we're trying to take the lid off of that. This is not something that you can just say one size fits all. And normalize talking about it, I think, too, because I do think there's a lot of shame that comes around this topic. I feel like, and it's often, I think, very taboo. I mean, I even recently spoke to a woman who, had an interaction where it kind of caused her some pain and some issues, trying to share with a certain group about her lived experiences, and it wasn't received well. And whether that was right or wrong, it's just sometimes there's not really a space too for people to really discuss this openly. So I really love that you're taking all the lids off of this. So as we kind of move forward, and Ginny's so good about like coming back. If like she's sitting here listening, and if we miss little nuggets and things that need to come back to, she'll come back. She picks up the pieces as we go. So so you had mentioned a little bit earlier just about different groups of people that this affects, and can you help us better understand everything from like whether mental health plays a part, or if there's marginalized populations, and just, what roles, accompanies that, whether it's isolation and, barriers to getting support and what have you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. So the only predictor of whether or not a person in an adult relationship is going to end up either being a perpetrator or a survivor of domestic violence is whether or not they experienced it in childhood, which people hate thinking about and hate talking about. But when children experience or witness domestic violence, they are 4 times more likely to perpetrate that kind of violence against their own partners as they age, and they're 3 times more likely to become victims of someone else as they age. There's some nuance there with like basically you tend to orient towards your same sex parent. So if I'm a little girl watching my mom be horribly abusive, I'm likely to end up as a perpetrator and vice versa, right? If I'm watching my mom be abused, I'm much more likely to be abused myself. So people have all kinds of feelings about that and believe it's like, oh, you must like it or you must be attracted to it, whatever. But ultimately, trauma reenactment is a function of social learning. The subconscious part of the brain where the amygdala sits attempts to solve the problem of threat by like revisiting that threat and seeing if they can like apply other solutions to it. So people tend to end up in abusive relationships if they witness them and or experience them as young people, especially between utero, so before they're born until they're like 10. That's like the critical period for social learning. That's not fixed, meaning you can't always reassign those patterns, and that's really the work of therapy actually. But that's what happens with people. So I say all that to say vulnerability usually attracts predators, right? So if I'm a person with a lot of vulnerability, I've withstood a lot of abuse in early life, I probably think it's my fault by virtue of being abused. And so when I get older and people treat me poorly, I don't think much of it. It might not even cross my mind as like unusual, for one. And for two, people who are marginalized or people who are pushed to the side in attention and resources, like in the mainstream, are more vulnerable because of the systems that we create around them. So I'll give you an example. Amongst women with intellectual disabilities, the women with that identity are reporting sexual assault at rates of over 80%, which is much more than the average. And of those 80%, I think it's actually 82, but of that group of people, half of those people have reported sexual assaults more than 10 times. So it's a very, very, very vulnerable population for sexual violence. I'd like to ask you two, like thinking through it, I know it's gross, but to try to think about if I'm a predator, if I'm a person who wants to rape someone, why would I choose a woman with an intellectual disability as a victim? What do we think?
Yeah, I mean, it instantly comes to mind is that they might not be as aware of kind of what's happening, and maybe no, a lot slower to probably come to the terms of like, no, I don't like what you're doing. Um, is what comes to my mind.
Yeah, you're
Maybe
right.
less likely, or they would assume less likely to report it because of maybe thinking, oh, they might not even understand, so less likely that they're going to tell someone, I
Yeah,
imagine. But maybe also just easier to coerce in ways. I could see that also being part of it.
yeah, and y'all are right, right? So like sometimes the virtue or the nature of having an intellectual disability can lend to a cognitive difference in that a person may not be able to fully understand immediately what's happening, or while they understand that it's not pleasant, they may not know how to communicate it, right? Or feel even compelled to communicate it. So that's a big part of it. What's also a huge part of it is that people with intellectual disabilities are infantilized and not treated like adults in any really way. And so they're not offered sex ed. So they don't know anything about puberty sometimes. They don't know anything about sex. They don't have a lot of lived experience of romantic and sexual interaction because sometimes their caregivers don't think it's appropriate and on and on. So they don't have a foundational understanding of consent or what normal romantic and sexual relationships are like. Um, that's a big part of it. Also, it's the legal system, right? So it's really, really hard to get a conviction on a sexual assault, even with a victim testimony and with evidence. It's just really challenging for 1,000 reasons that I don't have time to talk about. But some people with intellectual disabilities are considered, and I'm going to quote unquote this or whatever, but they're not considered competent witnesses in a state trial, meaning that they cannot testify on their own behalf to their experience. So you now have a sexual assault conviction with no victim, even if you have evidence that's challenging. So people with the desire to rape people will know that and choose that path sometimes. Also, people are often, just generally, people are more often assaulted by people they know. So, in a case with someone with an intellectual disability, they're going to have home health care providers around them all the time, potentially like, adult day program workers, social workers, people who wouldn't typically have access to that kind of, that level of access to a person around the clock. So, all of those reasons to say marginalization can create vulnerabilities that are exploited by predatory people, and that's across the board. So sometimes people will see, oh, the rates of domestic violence are higher in this racial community, or they're higher in this cultural community, or they're higher in this religious community. And we tend as humans to try to make sense of that by kind of inserting whatever belief we have about that group and to try to like do that causation thing, but it's a fallacy. It's a logical fallacy. It's usually correlation, not causation. And usually the correlation is actually to vulnerability created by the systems, not by the group of people themselves. So that's a great question, and I appreciate you asking, and I hope that that made sense.
Yeah, no, it really did. And I think that, something that you mentioned just about how people, um, sorry, I lost my train of thought. So I was kind of going somewhere with there, like trying to bring it back to about how people view this and how this applies to their everyday. I think that when people are are looking at this from the outside, I think that we have a lot of misconceptions, and it's even for people that maybe are not marginalized. The fact that you said, like, people that experience trauma growing up and they witness this growing up, how much more likely they are to adapt to it. I'm kind of bringing it full circle. When you talked about earlier, and you mentioned generalized or generational trauma, and experiences, and I'm guessing that's kind of what you mean by that, is like, because it just keeps going over. And I mean, hopefully at some point we stop it, right? And we go, like, this is enough. We're going to stop it at this line, and that's the point where healing comes in. But I think one thing I just want to point out really quick, as we're talking about all these sensitive topics, it's just for everybody to, have a lot of grace with themselves, whether you've tried to help somebody or you maybe have been a victim yourself, to just make sure that, you're not too tough on yourself. And if anybody's listening to this and maybe needs to take a break or a moment to step away, we get it. I think that, these are hard things to discuss and I think face, and I think that we all need to just be a little bit gentler around this, and even with ourselves, and acceptance. Because I know it sometimes can take a while to accept the things that have happened to us. So, this would be a really great point, really quick. I'm just going to take a quick break to just say, if you are enjoying this content and you want to help support Women for Mentors to help us keep bringing information like this to the surface and helping our community grow and thrive and get through the most difficult parts in life, just check us out at womenformentors.com. So with that, I'm going to actually pass this off into Ginny, and Ginny will help kind of pick up all the pieces, because we've gone through a whole gambit of information and hopefully be able to tie it back around. She's really good at weaving all that information back into filling it out. So appreciate it, Kadrin.
Thank you.
Yeah, I been taking some notes, had some questions anyway, but thought this might be a good time to sort of transition into talking a little bit more about community and supporting survivors because obviously you do a tremendous amount of work in that capacity. And I would definitely be interested in just kind of getting an idea about some of the things you do when you're, doing things like this, like speaking to people and kind of educating community on this issue. And also then maybe we can sort of delve into ways to support survivors, and we can finally circle back to the earlier question about, supporting someone who's like, having these trauma responses and things like that. I know that was kind of broad, but
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. You're right. Yeah. So, ideally, the only clear path, in my opinion, and I say only because that's my habit, one of the clearest paths to people breaking this cycle intergenerationally, which it often is, or breaking their cycle personally with abusive dynamics, is for them to start forming relationships that are healthy, meaning relationships that have reciprocal power, that are respectful, that are loving, that have conflict, but that the conflict is managed healthily and respectfully. Relationships without conflict lack intimacy, right? So we're not saying no conflict, we're saying manage conflict well. So I think that's one of the most effective interventions for people who experience power violence is forming a relationship that is respectful and respects the other person's autonomy and decision-making ability. So like I think a lot of the time when we're working with survivors, we have a tendency to be like, don't worry, I'll save you, right? And we like go into this like deep mode of like, I'm gonna be everything to you, and you can leave your abuser because I'm your whole world now. And that's the exact same dynamic as the one that they have with their abusive partner, right? So we have to be really mindful and constantly resource ourselves as helpers or whatever, quote unquote helpers, in that the person that we're talking to is the actual expert of their own life, of their own abusive partner, and of their own timeline. And they have freedom. They're allowed to do what they want. And I think that it's really important for us to constantly remind ourselves, like, I can focus and control me. I should not be trying to focus and control on other people and make them do things they don't want to do or push people before they're ready, right? So that's kind of the core of victim services and also of like how communities can support people is by being empowering towards people as they kind of suffer themselves, by being a listening ear as much as we're able and feel resourced to do that, and by having information and education ready and available. So my suggestion to folks who are not experiencing violence is that they learn as much as possible about the dynamics so that they can kind of offer that kind of education if it comes up, and that people really practice hard, which is another generational curse. I can fix this for you, right? This is really important to not orient towards people that way, especially survivors of power violence. So that is a big one. There's also in every single county in North Carolina and in most states, seriously, like there's so many rape crisis centers and domestic violence service providers across the country, and they're usually localized. So here in North Carolina specifically, we have a DVSP, a domestic violence service provider, and a rape crisis center in nearly every county. Not every county, but nearly every county. What rape crisis centers and domestic violence service providers can do kind of ranges across the board, but generally, there's usually a crisis hotline that you can call and talk to someone and safety plan and gain information. You can also use it as a free consultation service if you're supporting someone who's going through one of these things. Usually, domestic violence providers have an emergency shelter. They usually have some kind of court program if the person is interested in a restraining order. Just so y'all know, 50B is different than 50C, at least in North Carolina. There's domestic violence specific protective orders that give you a lot more than just no contact. And on and on and on. So in our case here in Buncombe, we do community case management. We have a free counseling clinic, both individual and group counseling. And I run our prevention program. So we go out into the community, we teach in the high schools healthy relationship skills, we teach in the jail and the prison, in detox, in almost all of the rehabs, the residential rehabs, anywhere where there might be people who are vulnerable. We go in and we talk about what's abusive, what's healthy, how can I achieve what I want to achieve, which for most people is a healthy relationship. So that's what you can expect locally from a provider like that. If you don't get that where you are, whoever you are listening, call the biggest one in your area and they can help you the best, and then keep going. I would not suggest that people start at the national hotline and then go down to the state hotline and then come local. I would suggest the opposite. So start local and then keep moving out as you find that you need more resources. But that's generally my suggestion for how people can actually intervene in this kind of dynamic.
Mhm. Would you say that kind of thinking about you mentioned that a person who maybe wants to support someone in their life could call and sort of have a consultation.
Yeah.
Do you have any other maybe guidelines, tips for what someone should do if they suspect, like their friend, family, loved one might be a victim of abuse? As we've talked about, there's ways maybe that you don't want to react, but you're also, you care about this person and maybe you're fearful for them and their safety. So I think that part can be difficult, knowing how to broach the topic, and kind of provide that support, like you said, on the timeline instead of saying you need to leave, right now and kind of freaking out about it. What are some practical ways, I guess, that a person could support and maybe broach the topic with a loved one?
Yeah, great question. Okay, so I want to suggest to y'all, I don't know who all is listening. Please find me on the internet and call me or go locally and call them, because I think it's an easy ask for us to like talk through this specifically. But I will say, okay, so a trauma-informed conversation should start with safety. So build physical and psychological safety into the relationship. So for like very practical example, when you have this conversation with someone, it should not be in a situation where they cannot get away from you. So we don't talk about it at this Thanksgiving dinner table. We don't talk about it in the elevator. We don't talk about it in a place where someone is forced to engage with the content, right? So that's a big one. Second big one is making sure that you can promise confidentiality. You need to figure out for yourself what that means for you, and you need to commit and stick to that if that's what you want to do. So sometimes what I see people doing is they'll say something like, "Oh yeah, you can tell me, I won't tell anyone." And then the person discloses something horrific and they freak out and they call the police or they tell everybody in the neighborhood, right? So confidentiality needs to happen at the beginning. So first is safety, second is confidentiality. Third thing is consent. It's like the first thing you have to say is the hardest thing, which is the feelings part. It's like, "Hey, I feel scared to have this conversation with you because I'm scared it's going to push you away. And I feel more scared that you're going to get hurt or that you are really going to come to harm. And so I'm risking pissing you off or upsetting you to ask you about what I see, right? So then you would use I statements and you would say, I see you experiencing fear. I see you having to check your phone 1,000 times a day. I see you not having access to your own money, whatever. You just really lay it out there, right? Then the second part of the conversation is the other person's going to react, right? More than likely, they're not going to react the way that you want them to. They're not going to be like, okay, and thank you for telling me. I've been waiting for this, right? That's not what's going to happen. What's likely going to happen is they're going to get triggered, meaning their amygdala is going to say fight, flight, freeze, right? When people react, it's our job to hold whatever their reaction is and to manage ourselves and to manage our own reaction to their reaction, right? So if somebody's like, you know what, F you, I'm out of here, then we're like, okay, I understand that. I'm here for you if you ever change your mind. And then we let them leave, right? If someone gets up and is like screaming, we say, I understand that this is upsetting, and I'm grateful that you feel like you can be angry with me. Again, it needs to come authentically. If you're just saying things as I tell you to say them, it'll be weird and probably won't work. But either way, people are going to react the way that they're going to react. Sometimes people will literally pass out. I've had clients before, I ask them something like, hey, like, I noticed that you have a bruise. Like, do you want to talk about that? And they will fall asleep immediately, right? Like a very extreme freeze response. So something's going to happen. They're going to react, right? It's our job to manage our reaction and to try to hold them through that. Then, once that's over with, which usually it's more than one conversation, reaffirming as much as possible, I care about you. I want to be helpful to you. I know that I can't solve these problems. I know that these problems are more complicated than they seem. I know that you love this person. I know all of these things. Here's what I want to offer you, right? Usually it's like, I want to offer you a listening ear. I want to offer you a bed if you need to get out of there. Whatever, blah, blah, blah. You offer something. They may take it, they may not. And then the conversation becomes, I think it would be a good idea for you to have a phone charged on you as much as possible. I think it'd be a good idea for you to make copies of your driver's license and your passport and your social security card and your birth certificate. I think it might make sense for you to have a bag with like a week's worth of clothes in it in case, right? And just very basically saying things about safety planning, and then y'all can kind of go from there, right? So relationships that are healthy go back and forth. So that's what I would suggest for that. It's a great question. And this is like a deep oversimplification, of course, of like what could happen. But generally, trauma-informed conversations start clearly. There's a strong support element to them where it's a lot of empathy, verbally and non-verbally. And it ends with affirming of the relationship, and then it ends clearly. It's not just like, oh, we'll talk about this forever, and this is our whole relationship now. It's like, cool, we can talk about this again when you feel like it. I'll be waiting, something like that. So, how does that sound? Does that sound okay? That's a lot of talking.
No, that's great. I mean, I think one big takeaway that I'm getting from this, and it's kind of everything you've said thus far, I think builds to this in my mind that if you suspect someone in your life, maybe a victim of abuse, and you want to approach them about it, it seems like you yourself need to really prepare, do a lot of research, read up on things, maybe call a helpline, make sure you're in the right emotional and mental space to start the conversation. Because, like you said, you don't know how they're going to react. So, making sure that you're managing yourself. And honestly, even though, like you said, you can't always know exactly how they're going to react, doing a little practice session in the mirror of like, these are the things I'm going to say. My big takeaway is do not jump into this on a whim when you're feeling emotional, even if like something happens today and you're like, oh no, I'm worried about maybe even listening to this and some things are sounding familiar to you and you start thinking about your friend or even yourself and you don't want to just turn around and then freak out and kind of rush into it. Something you said earlier that really struck me that I hadn't considered before is that especially for someone to leave, like we're thinking you need to go right now, but they might need that week or month or 6 months or whatever it is to actually plan and prepare everything. And it's more likely to be successful, I guess, if they actually take that time. So I kind of feel like that applies to maybe having the difficult conversation. Take a little time, even though it's not that it's not urgent, but you want to make sure that you kind of have all your ducks in a row before you jump into this. Because obviously it's very vulnerable and scary, and it's going to be difficult no matter what. Preparing as much as you can for the difficulty seems like something that everyone could kind of focus on first before just, like you said, locking them in the elevator with you and making them talk to you about it.
Yeah, yeah. Suffering is a normal part of life, and we hate that. We don't have cultural expectation for that. We don't have cultural tolerance for that. But suffering is a part of life, and like the more that we can be comfortable with that, the more authentic we can be when it's time to have these hard conversations with ourselves and with others.
Oh, definitely. Thinking about sort of the whole process, and then you said that you actually went to helpmate, yourself
Yeah.
and got support. Now you're on the other side of the desk. So I guess switching gears a little bit, thinking about sort of the survivor aspect, the resilience you've seen, the strength of survivors, kind of when they're coming out of that. If you happen to have any little anecdotes or, anything that's kind of surprised you, even with yourself or maybe some of the people you've worked with.
Yeah, I think I'm just going to be like very frank and authentic myself here. It's like most traumatized people are really funny. They're usually like pretty flexible. They usually have pretty tremendous capacity for a lot of things. Usually high empathy also, not always, but that ends up being a thing towards the end of the crisis period, potentially past the crisis period. The way that I think about it is every person is surviving daily. Even if you live with an abusive person, you never leave, you guys are married your whole life. There's so many acts of survival in a day or in an hour or even in like a few minutes where like people keep themselves safe. They keep themselves regulated. They keep themselves alive to some extent. Everybody does, right? People have natural resiliencies. People have their faith. People have their love of their children. People have their love of their friends and family, of their little pets. They enjoy natural beauty. They want to be happy. They experience joy, right? So I think that that's sometimes overlooked in that, like, similar to like, there's a myth that abusers are Disney villain, perfect evil examples, that survivors are Disney princess perfect examples of like human goodness, right? So it's like people are complicated. People are really complicated. So my thought is like, I've been doing this work for 7 years. And here in Buncombe County, we have about 3 domestic violence homicides per year, and we have had despite our population growth, there's always going to be the worst case scenario happening. And Helpmate serves 3,800 survivors a year annually and have been serving survivors since 1981 here, which accumulates to tens of thousands of people who I could walk behind me on the screen and I could show you so much resilience and healing and growth and success. Not everybody has those experiences. Some people suffer tremendously their whole lives. But in this field in particular, it's really, really important that we remember how we ourselves have recovered from hard things, the way that we bring and alchemize our pain and bring that into goodness in this world, and the way that other people are doing that too. So that's my thought about resilience, is that people who suffer tremendously also end up contributing tremendously to the lessening of the suffering of others. That's my thought.
Oh, that's very impactful. And even just thinking about all the people that have been helped, like you said, um, that's really incredible to think about on on a large scale. So I think you made some really great points that people are really complicated, and this is one part of your life, but it's not every single part of your life, and everyone does have to overcome hard things. Some people are different, but I think that's definitely just unfortunately part of the human condition. We just
Mhm.
so I think that's kind of gives survivors or people who are maybe not quite ready to take that step yet a little bit of hope. Which on that exact note, to kind of wrap things up, do you have maybe like a final sort of message of hope for survivors or people that are maybe still in a situation and are just now thinking about steps to get out of it?
Yeah, I would say that abuse naturally begets confusion. It naturally begets a sense of isolation. It naturally lends itself to a lot of psychological and emotional and physical suffering. And when people have those experiences, they feel and they perceive and they experience themselves as being the only ones that have those experiences. And so I will say to y'all, there are thousands, millions of people who've had these experiences, realized they were having them, gone through some kind of process of crisis, and then moved through it. So I want people to know there are hotlines. There are so many people, at least here locally, Helpmate has 32 staff. There's 32 women, and we have one man, right? That are sitting here, like, waiting to hear from you. So I just want everyone to know that wherever you are, wherever you're listening, there are other people who have gone through it and who have come out the other side of it who are just waiting for you. And you get to decide how you want to engage with that, but you're certainly not alone.
Nice. Oh, that's great.
I appreciate all this so much. I feel like, Katrin, we're gonna have to have you on again because we have so much more. I feel like we could dig into, even talking a little bit more about PTSD and the aftermath of that, and just really more about how we can help people, what our communities look like. So we're gonna definitely have to have you come back on at another time to dig in more, because I mean this was just so great, and you know this is really near and dear to our hearts here at Women for Mentors. You know, we this is what we're all about is and we're where you guys really help people getting through the process, and we're on the other side going like we want to help you transition back into the world, and you know help you with your scholarships, help you with mentorship, help you with the support so that you can rebuild your life. With that really quick, I will say that we are taking donations to help support organizations like Helpmate and people that are going through that process so that they can return to education as well. So I want to make sure that people know that this is something that we're so passionate about here. So just Katrin, thank you so much for just sharing your expertise with us today and being open and I think debunking some myths and just helping us be more aware how we can be a community around this topic, that we can talk about it in this open space and kind of normalize the discussion and make it part, because that's how we all grow and heal and move forward and kind of stop this generational trauma in its path. So could you just tell everybody really quick if they wanted to get in touch with you or help me, like what how can they do that? How can they reach out?
Yeah. Okay. So Helpmate's hotline is answered 24/7, 365. Our number is 828-254-0516. You can Google whatever area you're in. You can Google the local number for your specific agency. You can reach me at my email here. It's C as in cat, D as in dog, OYLE. So C Doyle at helpmate, HELPMATE online.org. You can also find me on LinkedIn if you forget all of that. So just send me a note. I'm pretty easy to find. I'm unfortunately pretty easy to find sometimes. But yes, I really would love to hear from survivors. I'd love to hear from people who want to be supportive pretty much all the time. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you for being our guest today. And we just want to say that together, when we support each other and lift each other up, we just all rise together. So until next time, thank you.